This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody. Jordan Girth here with the National Weather Service Office of Observations. Thank you so much for joining us for the Satellite Book Club Seminar Series. This is session number 202. Today's presenter is Michael Jurewicz, the Science and Operations Officer at the Weather Forecast Office at State College, Pennsylvania. I will be facilitating the discussion after Mike's presentation. Just a few reminders before we get started that this session is being recorded. And of course, we ask that if you're not presenting or asking a question, that you mute your microphone and turn off your webcam. There will be the opportunity for Q&A after the presentation, and we ask that attendees post their questions in the chat, and I will field them in the order they are asked. If you've signed in with an office account or a general account, please specify your full name when asking a question so that we can follow up if necessary. We're always looking for future presenters. Perhaps you have something lined up for the National Weather Association annual meeting that you'd like to get another set of eyes on it. We'd love to have you participate in the Satellite Book Club. Even if your talk is only peripherally related to satellite imagery, it would make a great contribution to our series. The training team can also help create training materials that may be unavailable or you may be unaware of. Ross Van Til can help with that. I'd like to thank the Office of the Chief Learning Officer, the GOES, R, and JPSS programs, our facilitator, presenter, and all of you for being with us today. I'd also like to thank Hashad and Emily from our Tower S team for everything they do behind the scenes to get us ready each and every week. All right, without further ado, let me introduce Mike Jurewicz, whose career has taken him from meteorologist, intern, to science operations officer after graduating from Rutgers University. He's been at 3 different offices, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Binghamton, and lastly, State College. Michael has been the satellite focal point at every office and has had the chance to collaborate on satellite-based operationally relevant research, not only at the local office level, but with cooperative institutions such as CIRA, CIMSS, and NESDIS. So I'm really glad to have Mike with us today. Welcome to the Satellite Book Club.
Thanks, Jordan. I really appreciate the invitation, and we're excited to be able to talk about FIM, flood inundation mapping. It's an emerging area of service enhancement for our agency, and will continue to be in the coming years. And you'll see towards the end of the talk, there is a remote sensing tie-in to FIM as well. And I'm lucky to have some true subject matter experts along to help me today. John Kirk from the Mid-Atlantic River Forecast Center and Charlie Smith from the Office of Water Prediction. And actually, John Kirk from MERFC is going to lead us off. So I'm going to hand the baton to John, and he'll start the presentation off, and then he'll hand it back to me here towards the middle.
So yeah, let's go ahead. Appreciate the opportunity to join the presentation here today. So thank you to Mike for the invite. Yeah, go ahead and advance the screen. So for those of you who are familiar with hydro operations here in the Weather Service, we know that the hydrograph traditionally since the AHAPS era has been the primary tool we have for communicating river forecasts as well as flood forecasts, in addition to watches, warnings, advisories. And so you can communicate a lot of information on a hydrograph. You can show how high the river is going to get over time, and you can also show when the river levels may exceed a critical threshold, minor, moderate, major flood. And so if we advance the slide one more, the thought is, what if instead of being able to just show the effect of river flooding and the river forecast on a graph, what if we could map it? What if we could be able to visualize what the hazards are to be able to showcase not only to emergency managers and first responders, but also the public, what their flood risk may be, especially as it pertains to real-time forecasts. And if we advance one more, the mantra I always try to think of is a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so to be able to visualize the flood forecast in map form, I think presents a very powerful opportunity for us moving forward. So advance. So I know a number of folks on the call here today are familiar with the Weather Service's flood inundation mapping project. But for those who may not be, the Weather Service is part of a congressional mandate, is tasked with implementing nationwide flood inundation mapping, or FIM as we call it, the capability to do flood inundation mapping across the nation by 2026. And so this goes not just for locations where we have existing river forecasts, but also for virtually every stream in the nation. So we're hoping to accomplish this in conjunction with the National Water Center and others to be able to leverage not just the river forecasts, but also National Water Model guidance to then be able to depict the flood risk in real time at these streams all across the nation. Now, it's an ambitious task, but it's exciting because we have a number of the tools in place already. And as we're rolling out this FIM capability in different corners of the nation over the next few years, it presents an opportunity for us to train up, both internally, but also with our partners. But it's also an opportunity to just take a look, to appraise this new tool that we have to see what it does and learn a little bit more about the water model, as well as some of the mapping capabilities itself. So if we advance the slide here. So there's over 3 million river miles that are in the National Water Model that are going to have flood mapping capability. And the majority of that, obviously, has never really been looked at before. So what we at the RFC have been doing as part of this FIM rollout is assisting both the WFO and the Water Center with just trying to review FIM and taking a look at what we've got and trying to learn some of the strengths and weaknesses. Those of you who are looking at this may know that, of course, we have gauge locations on a number of rivers, but the vast majority of streams in the nation do not have any gauge information. And so while we can take an educated scientific guess as to what's happening on those rivers, we don't necessarily have an observed way of knowing what's happening at any of those places. So because of that, in order to be able to introduce flood mapping, there are some certain strengths and weaknesses that went into the mapping capability in order to get that nationwide coverage. And so because of that, then, part of the reason for trying to review FIM is trying to understand how those strengths and weaknesses bear out in terms of being able to use these flood maps as forecast support and decision support tools. And so everybody on this call, as forecasters, as scientists, we know we're all experts in extracting valuable information from big data and sometimes even less than perfect data. And so that's really what we're trying to do with FIM here, is just try to extract the value that we can out of these tools to try to support the forecast message. The other point that I'll mention on this slide here is at the bottom there, that we have the opportunity with the Water Center. We have an in-house development team, folks who are dedicated around the clock to trying to roll out improvements to flood mapping and also take in some of the feedback that we in the field have from some of the local knowledge we have to be able to look back at the FIM, review it, and then be able to contribute to some fixes. And so it's a great, we're very thankful to have that ability and to have that team with us in the agency. Next slide. So there are a couple of ways of evaluating FIM as it stands now, and then we're going to hear a little bit more about that later on in this presentation. The Water Center has already taken the effort to compare some of the FIM that is being generated now, some of the new FIM maps, to some existing benchmarks. These can include some hydraulic flood maps from some advanced engineering studies that exist in some places, and other benchmark information. And essentially you can just compare and just say, are the new flood maps flooding where they're supposed to? Are they not flooding where they're not supposed to? And then do a classification of true positives and false negatives and all the rest, and then calculate some statistics and then use that to then refine the mapping procedures moving forward. But we only have that benchmark data in so many places. So we also at the RFC, especially here at Mid-Atlantic RFC, we've been spending a lot of time trying to use some of the local knowledge that we have to try to evaluate the new flood inundation maps at our forecast points, at places where we have at least a starting point. Because again, it's 3 million river miles, so where do you even start with trying to assess this new massive data set we have? So start with what you know. So we went with the forecast points and took a look at some benchmark information associated with that to try to assess areas where the map is performing well, maybe some areas where the limitations maybe kind of hold it back a little bit. And thankfully, the Water Center has provided us with a mapping platform where we can collaboratively add some of these annotations to the map to be able to showcase these areas where it's strong and maybe where there's some improvements to be made. And so if we advance the slide here, some of the information that we're using to try to base these reviews off of course, would include the impact statements from the E19s or now on NWS. If we advance the slide. Next, thank you. Yep, so so in addition to the flood impact statements, we also have FEMA floodplain maps, which are a fabulous resource. They're available across a broad part of the nation, but they're only tied to the 100-year and the 500-year flood event. So we don't necessarily know dynamically what a flood that's not quite that severe, or maybe a flood that's even worse than that might look. And so we're trying to collect as much information as we can. And then finally there on the screen, as you can see, we're also trying to streamline some procedures of pulling in flood photos and videos and imagery that we see. We just had it last week with some of the flooding from Debbie. Lots of folks posting on social media some photos and videos that they've taken of that information. And that's, it's an unfortunate scene to see the flooding, but it's great information for us to be able to validate some of these flood maps to compare, to just see just how are these tools doing. And so on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Mike, who can speak to some specific examples here of how we're leveraging flood inundation maps to help with decision support services. So Mike, I'll hand it back over to you.
So as he stated, I'm going to talk about a specific event that we had in Pennsylvania this past spring in early April. So I'm going to start with just a very brief meteorological overview. So as you can see with the slides down below, this was a favorable heavy rain pattern for the east, a deep closed upper low to our west in the Ohio Valley, a deep moist southerly flow transporting pretty high precipitable water values for early April into Pennsylvania. And then also there was a double jet structure at the upper levels. There was a pretty strong southern branch that was coming out of the southeastern states, a retreating northern jet led over New England. So very nice upper level diffluence to help maximize the upward motion. So you can advance to the next slide. And then these are two 24-hour rainfall totals across Pennsylvania. So this was an event where we had several successive rounds of heavy rain. So obviously each one adding more to the antecedent conditions. So there was generally some showers and thunderstorms that produced 1 to 2 inches of rain over the southern part of our forecast area in south central Pennsylvania. And then the bigger slug came across the next day, April 2nd into the early morning of April 3rd. We're pretty widespread 2 to 3 and even locally approaching 4 inches of rain in central PA. So this is a time of year, we're coming out of winter. Vegetation really hasn't spun up yet. So we don't necessarily have a lot of room for error in terms of holding the water in the soil. So getting these repeat rounds of heavy rain is definitely not welcome in this neck of the woods at that time of year. So you can advance to the next slide. Okay, and it also came on the heels of what had been a pretty wet couple of months, a rainy and at times snowy end to last winter. So generally the greens and blues are progressively higher percentages of above climatology rainfall. So in the preceding month in March, again, you can see we had generally above average rain from the above average precipitation from the lower Great Lakes and Ohio Valley across Pennsylvania, even more so up and down the coastal plain, the Atlantic coastal plain. And then April was a very wet month. This event was the first, and we had a couple more decent precipitation events after that. So that kind of sets the stage for what happened here. So you can advance. All right, so we're dealing with the latest round of heavy rain that just went through on April 3rd. Our operations staff is issuing flood warnings, and closely monitoring local waterways. So we get a call from the Deputy Director of Emergency Services here in Center County, which is the county I'm sitting in right now, and a small town, a town of Milesburg, which sits about 10 to 15 miles north of here. They were very concerned about the Bald Eagle Creek, a small tributary that runs through that town. And there's a nursing home that sits just off that creek. And although the water was still within its banks at the time, the levels were rising. So they were concerned, was the creek going to come out of its banks? Was it going to inundate the road right in front of the nursing home to affect the flow of traffic? And worse yet, would the nursing home itself take on water? As you can well imagine, evacuation of any nursing home is difficult under any circumstance. And they were also concerned about some of their medical equipment. So they certainly needed some help from us. And so our job at that point was to give them the best IDSS possible to help them out. So you can advance. All right, so the map down on the lower right-hand side, the maybe a little bit hard to see, but the blue oval that I have drawn in here on this street view is where the nursing home is located. And then there is a stream gauge on the Bald Eagle Creek, but unfortunately it's downstream of where the nursing home is, and also downstream of where this is kind of an area where you had a confluence of two creeks, and also downstream of that. So although certainly a helpful piece of data, it may not represent the flow that we want to see exactly where we need it. So that was one little piece of information that we had in trying to determine how to give Center County the best information at this point. We knew by the gauge that although the water levels were rising, they were starting to level off a little bit. And like I said, we had just had 2 slugs of heavy rain come through the last 24 hours. There was a third round expected later that day, but that rain was projected to be substantially lighter than what we had just come through in the last 24 to 36 hours. So these are all information pieces that's going to factor into what we tell Center County. So you can advance to the next slide. Okay, so we started thinking to ourselves, how could we maybe leverage the relatively new flood inundation mapping data sets to help us out? Because again, the gauge was downstream. Just based on that information alone, it may not really tell us exactly what we need to know about water encroaching or not on the nursing home. So what we did first of all is we pulled up what's called the analysis FIM, which is the National Water Model's idea basically of what the inundation looks like at the current time. And luckily we had officials from Center County that were on site at the nursing home. So they were able to verify for us how well is the water model doing right now with the analysis. And that's the information that we were seeking. So what you're looking at on the map, the shaded blue is where the water model thought the level of inundation was at that time, which was right about 1 p.m. on April 3rd. And so again, we had boots on the ground right at that site, and they were able to let us know, you know, Mike, we think your model's running a little bit hot. The water is, the level of inundation isn't quite as extensive as what your model's showing. It's not over the railroad tracks like the graph shows here. It's not really encroaching on Front Street in front of the nursing home like the model might indicate. Although the level's coming up, it is still within its banks. So that was great information for us. So we were able to tell at that point, okay, the analysis FIM is a little bit overdone in terms of inundation. So you can advance to the next slide. All right, so again, think of all the things that we were just talking about. The initial analysis was a little bit overdone in terms of inundation. We knew that for the most part, in terms of total rainfall over a couple of days, it was mainly already on the ground. We weren't expecting more additional rounds of heavy rain. Again, the next round was expected to be lighter. So what you're looking at on this slide is the maximum inundation FIM. So this is basically what the model thinks the max inundation in that area is going to look like sometime within the next 18 hours. And it really doesn't look a lot different than what the analysis FIM looked like on the previous slide. So again, putting all these pieces together, analysis FIM, a little bit overdone. The maximum inundation that the model thinks is going to happen isn't really much more than the analysis shows. The level of rise is slowing. The next round of rain is not expected to be as heavy. All of that boiled down to giving us fairly decent confidence that the water was not only not going to get to the nursing home, but probably not even going to get to the roadway in front. So we provided that almost kind of probabilistic forecast that we were fairly confident that, although we would certainly keep watching, that the flooding would not get to the point where you would need to evacuate the nursing home. And thankfully, that turned out to be the right call. So you can advance to the next slide. So some of the feedback we got from Centre County, they were extremely grateful. Long story short is, this is a direct quote from them, and that we helped save not the county officials and the workers at that facility from a difficult and unnecessary evacuation. So that made us feel pretty good. They told us about how much they appreciated the assistance that we provided. So basically, this was an example of a fairly critical IDSS scenario where, although FIM was not initially requested as part of the data point to help out, we felt it was a data set that was able to best address the concern, best address the problem that needed to be investigated. And the real-time validation and verification of FIM was really crucial. I think this is a great example. When I first went down to the water center at the beginning of the FIM 10, State College is one of the offices in the 10% rollout of FIM. So we were one of the guinea pigs right out of the gate. And one of the phrases that was often used back then is, don't let perfection be the enemy of good. And I think this is a great example of that, an example of where the guidance we were getting from the water model was certainly not spot on. The inundation was overdone, but we were able to make the mental adjustments based on the verification and based on future expectations to be able to provide a pretty high level of IDSS. So we thought this was a good use case of FIM. And so now I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton to Charlie Smith down at the Water Center, and he's going to talk about maybe some emerging future capabilities of FIM.
All right, thanks, Mike. Can everyone hear me okay? All right.
Yep.
Okay, all right, you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlie Smith. I'm a senior hydrologist here at the National Water Center, and I'm also the Flood Inundation Mapping Program Lead. So I'm tasked with guiding our operations division on how we facilitate FIM IDSS, FIM-based forecast guidance to our core partners, and also we provide reach-back capabilities and support of our partners and field offices during these big hydrologic events. And so what that boils down to, I think, if you look at this past tropical system, Debbie, during that event, the National Water Center staffed, increased the staffing during the day, and also stayed open 24 hours. We went 24 hours during that time. And we continuously looked at FIM, evaluated FIM, looked for potential impacts, and we passed that information along to the field offices. Folks like Mike and also Jonathan as well, pass that information to them so they could help their partners and help them make decisions. One of the things that we use to help us with FIM is remote sensing, of course, and we have a remote sensing team here at the National Water Center, and I'm going to be talking about that and how we use that to support our FIM operations. So right now our remote sensing desk, they do flood inundation mapping based on remote sensing data. They do river ice mapping. They also use remote sensing to characterize basins, looking for change in different things like vegetation, soil moisture, snow, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. So remotely sensed flood inundation mapping, we use it for model verification. We take that remote sensing data, we use an algorithm to identify areas that are inundated. We'll pull that data into our in-house viewer, and we'll compare it with the National Water Model FIM that we have being produced here in-house. And then we'll do that evaluation with that remotely sensed data, and then communicate that evaluation to the field to help them with their IDSS. Here in this image, you can see where we have some National Water Model FIM, RFC FIM actually to be exact, and also our remotely sensed flood inundation mapping as well for comparison. One thing that we also use it for is to characterize the pluvial flooding impacts or ponding. This is that type of flooding that you might see in very highly urbanized areas where the water just doesn't have anywhere to go. You get intense rainfall rates and the water just ponds up everywhere. And the National Water Model just doesn't really predict that sort of inundation. So we can use this remote sensing data to characterize that pluvial flooding impacts or ponding. The National Water Model, the framework for it is based on flow lines and stream flows, flow lines from the USGS's National Hydrologic Dataset. So the inundation is drawn from those flood lines. So you can see why it doesn't really show that type of ponding or that type of inundation. So that's where the remote sensing comes in. Next slide, please. So in addition to remotely sensed flood inundation mapping, we also do river ice classification as well. And this is important for FIM. The image here on the right shows the detection of river ice on the North Platte River in Nebraska back in 2021. The red you see there on the river is high confidence for ice. On the lower left, we have a hydrograph there with a signature ice jam with a sharp increase there in the stage despite no rain upstream. And this is usually associated with very frigid temperatures, and forecasters are usually quick to identify when they have an ice jam in these hydrographs like this. Next slide, please. So currently the National Water Model, it ingests flow from these gauges, from these USGS gauges. And as it ingests flow from these gauges, it draws that inundation on the map that we use in our products. Part of the problem with that is that the National Water Model, as it ingests that data, it may not capture gauges that are ice affected correctly. And it may not capture reach where there's ice that's covered in ice. It may not capture that correctly. So the National Water Center has been working on a collaborative dashboard to incorporate the remote sensing data and also incorporate the forecaster's knowledge to help mitigate some of these issues that we might see when you have an ice-affected gauge or an ice jam or a river that's covered in ice. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a prototype of that dashboard, and what the idea behind it is that the forecaster will use that remote sensing data, and they'll be able to use this dashboard and highlight stream reaches or areas that they found to be impacted by ice, whether it's remote sensing. There's also going to be a collaborative aspect to this where they can collaborate with the field. But all of this is in a way to incorporate all of this data and then highlight these areas that are impacted by ice or covered in ice. That way these stream reaches are not drawn in the National Water Model. So that way it's not putting out inundation that might be incorrect. Next slide, please. All right. So this kind of highlights what that would look like if we're looking at our mapper and we're looking at some of the FIM. Let's say there's an ice jam maybe near that confluence right there on the image on the left. Downstream of that confluence, maybe there's ice along that reach. So the forecaster would go into the dashboard using that remotely sensed data and highlight that area. That way it doesn't draw in the data that we're looking at, or at least we're aware that something's going on there. And that image on the right there would kind of show how that would look like once that data is flagged. All right, next slide, please. So what does this mean for FIM, and how does how do we incorporate this into FIM, and what's it mean for FIM totally? It improves the quality of a National Water Model FIM used by the National Weather Forecast Offices in support of their partners. It's going to improve the adoption of FIM in some of the colder regions. When forecasters in some of these colder regions see that we're actually flagging this data that may be affected by ice, and this incorrect data might is flagged and not showing, it's going to give them greater confidence in the FIM. It's also going to prevent inaccurate FIM from being included in some of the post-event FIM verification efforts, which we do quite often. And also this dashboard, it's going to incorporate the experience and knowledge of forecasters with that remote sensing analysis. It's going to combine the two, kind of help improve our FIM and our FIM operations. And that's all I had. I'll go ahead and pass it back to Jordan for questions and comments.
All right. Thank you so much. And sorry for some of the technical difficulties there. I actually think it's a go-to problem, not so much any of the individual presenters. I had to leave and come back as well. If you have questions, please enter them in the chat. I know we're running a little behind, but I'm happy to take a few questions. While you're doing that, I just wanted to point out that a week from today, on Thursday, August 22nd, at the same 12 noon Eastern time, we're going to have Dan Lindsay, the GOES-R program scientist, talking about the GXI instrument for GeoXO. So we've been having some workshops lately. If you haven't been able to tune into one of those, please come next Thursday. Should have a great update on the GXI, which is going to be the follow-on for the ABI. In the meantime, if you have any questions for the TowerS team, Kashad and Emily can answer your questions about the book club or otherwise. Your email addresses are there, or you can find us on the Slack channel. All right, well, let's go ahead and head to the questions. Looks like we just have one comment in the chat so far, but I'll kick it off, mainly because I'm a little less familiar with where we stand with FIM, but what kind of training is necessary for staff on the FIM and how to best apply it to some of the services the Weather Service provides?
Yeah, so training's been a pretty heavy lift at the WFO and the RFC level. I think especially maybe the WFO, because this really gets into some of the nuts and bolts of hydrology and hydraulics and that type of thing. So maybe a little bit out of our comfort zone at the WFO, but you know, there was a fair amount of training on the board at the start. The Office of Water Prediction initially developed some modules that the forecasters could take, and then they've been continually improved over time. A lot of different offices have run their own workshops and run their own exercises and simulations to help the staff get more up to speed, do a lot of one-on-one training. So it's mostly been that kind of thing, but there's certainly a pretty heavy lift on the front end. But again, you know, this is the type of transformational service that I think will really help the agency going forward.
I see there's a question in there about what river or stream level is for the threshold for inundation. I can answer that real quick. Sure. For the RFC FIM, the action stage is the threshold, and for National Water Model FIM, it's generally near the 2-year return interval, but it kind of varies from region to region. And those are the threshold in which the FIM draws.
Looks like there is another question in the chat from Emily asking about the wondering how much outreach for Mike J, wondering how much outreach you had done with the emergency managers responsible for the nursing home before the event, and what was especially helpful in messaging the uncertainty.
Yeah, so what we did, and again, I'm sure this is not unlike what most WFOs had done, we had almost done a FIM outreach campaign, if you will. So we had a goal over a period of time to get to as many of our counties as we possibly could. Initially just advertising the service, because this is, you know, not something that the Weather Service had historically done in terms of mapping the inundation. So first we just wanted to let them know what this is and that it's coming. And what we did right off the bat is for each county, and Center County is an example of that, is we almost brought like a little local FIM book for the county folks to keep, like an example of maybe what a map could look like on one of the rivers or tributaries in their county, and some of the things they could expect that way. So I think the fact that the Center County officials, you know, that we had gone up to their office and done that initial outreach, and that they had some familiarity with it. You know, we had talked with them off and on Slack during the event. So I think they had enough awareness where, you know, they felt that we had some data sets that we could possibly use to help them. So I think that was an example of where the initial outreach paid some dividends down the road.
All right, I think I'm back. Thanks for filling in for the Q&A. Seems like there's very slow. Do not hit your mute button because it may not let you unmute. Looks like we've got time for just one more question here from Mike Jamakowski. Do some of your FIM techniques come from the work that Mitch Goldberg, Bill Schoberg did at the JPSS and GOES Proving Grounds?
Now, I don't know for sure. I might have to look that one up. I don't know if John or Michael have anything they can add about that.
I am honestly not sure on that one.
Okay.
Yeah. I was going to say, Jordan, I can probably jump in. We do work very well, we work very very closely with Sean Carter and Casey Curry at the National Water Center. They are the ones that do the developers for CIRS. So there's a lot of interaction with the NOAA flood team, the NOAA NESDIS flood team, that is, for satellite-derived flood extents from GEO, LEO, and SAR data. And, so there is a lot of interactions between, well, to Jammer's question, the techniques that Mitch and Bill funded initially through the JPSS and GOES Proving Grounds, Dan also funded through the JPSS, the GOES part of the Proving Grounds, but they are a very integral part of the team. And we, as I mentioned in my little message, we greatly appreciate all of the help that they've given. APFRC has used SARS during the wintertime, and for looking for ice, and there's been a lot of discussion utilization up there. So we really appreciate. There's a lot of people that really appreciate the work of of Sean and Casey. So hopefully that answers Jammer's question.
All right. Yep. Thank you, William. We'll take one last question here from Jonathan Howell. Mike, Jay, how heavy of a staffing load has FIM been for your staffing? Have you been able to keep up with the amount of support requested?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jonathan. So I guess I can best characterize that as we're still kind of feeling our way through that over time. For the specific event that I talked about, the operational staff that day was pretty swamped, to pardon the play on words, with issuing flood warnings and other near-term stuff going on with that event. So myself and the WCM were the one that we were back in our offices, and we were able, luckily, to handle that IDSS request and leverage FIM to an appropriate level. That really helped us. I think we're still trying to figure out how to make all that work in a busy hydro event, because we're not really used to thinking of how do you incorporate something like FIM in operations. So yeah, we're still feeling our way through that, but we know that this is something that can really help us. We know it's something that the partners have wanted for a long time. So we're going to figure it out. We're going to figure out how to best leverage the staffing to it. But I don't know if I have any hard and fast answers with that yet.
All right. And Jonathan followed up, said that was our concern as well. And there's often multiple hazards at the same time with no hydrologist. And that's something we talk about a lot in the weather services. Some of our job is the meteorology, but it's quickly growing out into other areas. Not only the hydrology, but also the communication and how we work all of those things together to provide the best services. So, Mike, I really want to thank you and John and David for the presentation, and we're dealing with some of the technical issues. We're going to follow up after this to figure out exactly what happened with GoToMeeting today. But thanks to everybody for sticking with us through this. As always, the Satellite Book Club continues next week, Thursday, noontime Eastern, our regular time. Hope to see some of you back then. In the meantime, feel free to get in touch with our TowerS team if needed. That's all for today. Thanks again to our presenter and all of you for being with us. Continue to have a great summer all. Bye-bye.